I pulled into my driveway expecting the usual quiet scene. My daughter loved sitting outside after school, humming to herself while arranging her dolls along the concrete like they were guests at some tiny tea party. But that afternoon, something felt wrong the second I stepped out of the car. She was sitting there exactly where she always did, yet the sound I heard wasn't laughter. It was quiet, broken crying. When I got closer, my stomach dropped. Sandra's small hands were covering her face, her shoulders shaking, and scattered all around her on the pavement were long strands of brown hair. For a moment, my brain refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. Then she slowly lowered her hands and my heart stopped cold. Her head was completely shaved. The clippers were lying a few feet away like evidence at a crime scene. I knelt down, pulling her into my arms while trying to keep my own hands from shaking. "Who did this?" I whispered. Through soft, trembling sobs, she finally said the name. Karen. Until that moment, our neighborhood had always felt quiet and predictable in the best way. It was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes in lazy circles around the block, and neighbors waved from their porches like they'd been doing it for decades. Nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen there, and honestly, that was exactly why I liked it. After long workdays, coming home to that calm routine with my daughter was the one thing that made everything else feel manageable. Sandra was the heart of that routine. She had this way of filling the house with energy that made even the smallest moments feel important. One minute she'd be staging elaborate adventures with her dolls. The next she'd be racing across the yard chasing bubbles she had blown herself. Her laugh carried down the street sometimes, and more than once a neighbor joked that they could hear her happiness from inside their living rooms. But if Sandra was the sunshine of the neighborhood, Karen was the storm cloud everyone quietly tried to avoid. She was the head of the HOA, and she carried that title like it gave her the right to control everything within eyesight. Rules were her favorite weapon, and she never missed an opportunity to remind people that she was the one enforcing them. Most of us had learned the same lesson early on. Life was a lot easier if you simply stayed out of Karen's way. A few days before everything fell apart, the first crack in that quiet routine appeared. It started with a sharp banging sound that echoed through the house while I was sitting in the living room. At first, I thought something had fallen in the garage, but the noise came again harder this time, like someone hitting the front door with a hammer. When I opened it, the truth was standing right there on the walkway. Karen's son Dylan was in the middle of my yard, gripping a fist-sized rock like he was competing in some strange demolition contest. Another stone slammed against the side of my car just as I stepped outside. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I shouted. The kid froze instantly, eyes wide, arms still halfway through another throw. I walked toward him slowly, keeping my voice firm but controlled. I didn't touch him, didn't even step closer than a few feet. I just pointed at the dent forming on my car door. "You throw one more rock and your mom's paying for the damage. Understand?" That was enough. Dylan dropped the stone and sprinted down the street like he'd just escaped a monster. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't even 30 minutes later when someone started pounding on my door like they were trying to break it down. I opened it to find Karen standing there, sunglasses pushed up on her head, her face twisted with fury. "How dare you lay a hand on my son?" she screamed. I blinked in disbelief. I didn't touch him. A neighbor from across the lawn stepped forward, explaining he'd watched the entire thing and that Dylan had been the one throwing rocks. Karen didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on me, cold and furious. "You'll get a taste of your own medicine," she said before storming away. A few days passed after that confrontation, and on the surface everything seemed to settle back into normal. Karen stayed on her side of the street and I stayed on mine. No shouting, no complaints, no sudden knocks at the door. Part of me wondered if maybe the threat she'd made was nothing more than anger spilling over in the moment. People say things when they're upset. Maybe that was all it was. That Saturday morning felt completely ordinary. Sandra had been excited all week about a playdate at Greg's house next door. His son Jacob was her best friend on the block, and the two of them could spend hours inventing games that made sense only to them. I dropped her off before heading to run a few errands, promising I'd pick her up later that afternoon. While I was gone, Greg later told me everything had seemed normal at first. The kids were playing in the backyard, laughing and running through the sprinklers, when someone knocked on his door. When he opened it, Karen was standing there. She told him there was an emergency. According to her, I had called and asked her to come pick Sandra up immediately because something urgent had happened at home. Greg hesitated for a moment, confused, but Karen sounded calm and convincing. She even smiled as she reassured him it was nothing serious. Eventually, he let Sandra go with her. And the worst part of it all was that at that exact moment, miles away running errands, I had absolutely no idea my daughter was walking straight into Karen's revenge. When I finally pulled back into the driveway later that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt. Usually, Sandra would run out the moment she heard my car, waving excitedly or shouting about whatever game she and Jacob had invented that day. But this time, there was no laughter, no footsteps, nothing except a small figure sitting on the concrete near the garage. As I stepped closer, I realized she was crying. Then, I saw the hair. Long, brown strands were scattered across the pavement like someone had dumped them from a brush. And right in the middle of it all was Sandra, her shoulders shaking. When she slowly looked up at me, my heart nearly stopped. Her head was completely shaved. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. I knelt down beside her, trying to steady my voice while every instinct inside me screamed that something was terribly wrong. "Sweetheart, who did this?" She sniffed, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress. "Miss Karen," she whispered. My stomach twisted. Sandra explained through shaky breaths that Karen had told her something was wrong with her hair. She said Daddy had asked her to help fix it because there were lice. Karen had brought out the clippers and told her it was the only way. I felt the anger rising so fast it was almost dizzying. Still holding Sandra close, I marched straight to Greg's house and demanded to know why Karen had been anywhere near my daughter. The look on his face told me everything before he even spoke. Karen had lied, and suddenly her threat made perfect sense. I left Greg standing there apologizing and walked straight toward Karen's house with Sandra's words echoing in my head. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the anger inside my chest was pushing me forward whether I wanted it to or not. By the time I reached her front porch, my hands were shaking so badly I had to knock twice before the sound even registered. Karen opened the door with the same calm expression she always wore, like she had nothing to worry about. "You shaved my daughter's hair," I said, barely keeping my voice steady. Instead of denying it, she folded her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before scaring my son," she replied, almost casually. For a split second, I felt the urge to lose control right there on her porch. But anger wasn't going to fix what she had done. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed the police. The patrol cars arrived faster than I expected. Within minutes, the quiet street filled with flashing lights and curious neighbors watching from their lawns. Karen tried to switch her story the moment the officer stepped out, claiming I was harassing her. That lie didn't last long. One officer reviewed my porch camera footage and saw everything clearly. Dylan throwing rocks, me confronting him without ever touching him, and Karen's story falling apart piece by piece. When they placed the handcuffs on her wrists, the entire neighborhood watched in stunned silence. And I made sure the charges followed. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Once the police reviewed the footage and collected statements from Greg and several neighbors, Karen's story completely collapsed. What she had done wasn't some petty HOA dispute anymore. It was child abuse, deception, and deliberate harassment. The charges stacked up quickly, and for the first time since all of this started, it felt like the truth actually mattered. In court, the judge didn't treat it lightly. Karen was convicted and sentenced to prison time, along with heavy fines and a civil payment to help cover the emotional damage she caused. She was immediately removed from the HOA board, and the same neighborhood she once tried to control slowly turned its back on her. People stopped defending her. Some even admitted they'd been afraid to speak up before. As for Sandra, her hair eventually grew back. But the memory of that day reminded me of something important. Protecting your family sometimes means standing firm when someone crosses a line they never should have touched. But I'm curious what you think. Do you believe Karen got what she truly deserved?